Okay, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm looking forward to your reactions to this topic. Oops, I'm already going way too ahead. So the topic is essentially multilateral trade governance. Where are we? And I think more concretely, where can we go? What should we do to actually deal with the current situation that we're confronting? What I'm going to say essentially is elaborated in a much longer way in a report that was done, that was supported by the Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany, who put together a board, a group of people who are experts on trade, a mix of academics, people who used to be negotiators or who currently still are, working for governments, and essentially the mandate that they gave us was to think about what can we actually do to solve some of the problems that are confronting the WTO today. So a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about today is essentially talking about what the recommendations are that we have in that report. Just in the way of background, I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody in this room that we're seeing a lot of increasing trade tensions in different parts of the world, and to a significant extent those tensions are emanating from Washington, D.C. Right, so we're seeing a recourse and a revised recourse to what in the 1980s would have been called aggressive unilateralism by the United States. Essentially, we're seeing a repeat of that type of a strategy where essentially trade measures are being imposed on imports as a way of trying to put pressure on countries to change their policies. And because some of the things that the United States has been doing are essentially not living up to the WTO obligations, we're also seeing countries that have been targeted by the U.S. retaliating, right? So that's kind of one of the big kind of pressure points today, which is putting pressure on the WTO. But another thing, which I'm not going to talk about a lot today, but we can come back to this in the discussion session, is we're also seeing pressure being put on the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. So the United States has for a very long time been unhappy with the way the appellate body of the WTO rules in specific areas, notably here with respect to anti-dumping type of actions, and they have kind of continued a policy which was started under the Obama administration of not approving appointments of new judges to the appellate body as current sitting judges' terms expire. So what is underlying a lot of these trade tensions is essentially, it's a mix of things. And what we argue in the report, and there's quite a long discussion in the report, which I'm not going to get into here today, in terms of how the world economy has actually changed as a result of a mix of policy reforms, including trade liberalization, but mostly through technological changes, and mostly through unilateral policy actions by developing countries, which has made them kind of much more integrated into the world economy. So outward-looking types of policies, which of course were very much front and center in East Asia. And of course, the big thing that has been driving this is the very rapid rise of China, right? So the Chinese share of global GDP, the Chinese share of global manufacturing employment has been rising extremely fast, and that is giving rise to a lot of pressures, adjustment pressures in countries around the world, including, of course, in the OECD countries. Another key driver, I think, behind what we're seeing today in the WTO is the fact that WTO members have been unable to actually get a deal on the Doha Development Agenda, which was the big multilateral trade negotiation launched in 2001, which was the first negotiation under WTO auspices. And the fact that this has been a failure, that we haven't been able to get to closure on the Doha round, has also impeded a discussion of new issues, including the types of issues that are giving rise to concerns in Washington, but also in Brussels with respect to, for example, what is happening in China with respect to Chinese industrial policies. So what that means is that the WTO membership has not really been very effective at dealing with what the WTO, in a sense, has been created to deal with, which is these policy tensions, these different perceptions on what the effects are of different types of policies. And in particular, of course, China here is front and center with respect to allegations that state capitalism and industrial policies in China are creating significant negative spillovers for the rest of the world. But I would argue, and we see this is strongly emphasized, I think, also in the report, that this is not just a China issue, right? So if you think about what is going on in terms of policy, we see very similar types of policies being pursued in India or in Brazil, or for that matter, in the European Union, United States, where really the agenda is one of trying to attract investment into the territory of a particular jurisdiction and ensuring that a lot of the technology and innovation occurs in your country as opposed to another country. So Pascal Lamy, when he was Director General of the WTO, came up with this famous phrase to kind of illustrate what globalization is all about and why global value chains and global supply chains are a good thing. So he used this word of products nowadays are made in the world, right? They're not made in a particular country, they're made in the world. Well, I think increasingly politicians around the world don't like this notion at all, and they would like to see things made here, right? Made in my country. Perceptions of unfairness, I think, are also an important part of the story. So partly we have allegations and perceptions that policies that countries are pursuing are imposing negative effects on other countries, so beggar than neighbor types of dimensions of policies. We've seen a resurgence in mercantilist thinking, and certainly that is something which is front and center in Donald Trump's mind, where essentially surpluses are good, deficits are bad, and I want to have a surplus with every country that I trade with, and then trade will be fair. Right now, economists, of course, are continuously trying to explain that this is complete nonsense, but I think it is an important driver of policy. And I think another important background dimension to this, which I think has a lot more kind of legitimacy, is that many consumers, many citizens of countries around the world are strongly of the view that for trade to be fair, we need to be trading with countries that actually have good labor standards, that are protecting the environment, that are actually doing and pursuing policies which deal with environmental related spillovers. And again, as I already said, this is an agenda where a lot of the newspaper articles are all about the fight between the United States and China, but if you listen to Mr. Trump, he's been equally scathing about the German trade surplus, about German cars being produced in a very unfair manner. And most recently, I think last week, he had a tweet saying that, even if the EU were to get rid of all tariffs on imports of cars, these Europeans would still not buy American cars, which of course illustrates that Europeans are very unfair people. So we won't get into the details of this, but I think the point here is, which is an important point, that even though China is the focal point for a lot of attention, this is not just a Chinese issue. So just a bit of background, if you look at what's been happening to trade policy since the financial crisis, you see a very distinct pattern of a number of countries becoming much more active and proactive in the use of trade distorting policy measures, whereas other countries don't show that at all, right? So if you look at the countries in this particular graph, this is data that comes from the Global Trade Alert, which is an initiative that is being run by Simon Eminent at St. Gallen University. We see some countries like Australia here, Japan, essentially not doing a lot, right? So essentially trade policy continues the way it's always been. These countries are abiding by the rules of the game that have been negotiated, whereas other countries, Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Russia, the US, a significant number of large countries have become much more interventionist with respect to trade policies. If you ask what is going on here, what kind of policies are we talking about, a lot of those policies are subsidy related, right? So if you look at all the actions that have been taken since 2009, you say, okay, where's the mass of that activity? Import tariffs and contingent protection, so anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards, account for about a quarter of all the actions that you see reflected in that previous graph. About half of them are subsidy related, right? And here we're talking standard production subsidies, but we're to a large extent talking about investment subsidies, about essentially make it here types of policies, which is all about I want to attract investment to my country and I want to promote exports of the firms that are in my country And here I don't just use explicit export subsidies, but we can also use the indirect taxation regime. We can do VAT rebates. There's various ways of subsidizing exports. So according to this data collection exercise, that's where a lot of the action is. And if you then look at what's been happening with respect to the WTO dispute settlement, what are countries objecting to, you don't see a whole lot of dispute settlement actions being taken against alleged violations of the WTO with respect to the subsidies agreement or export subsidies. So by implication, a lot of these policies are either what Richard Baldwin a long time ago called murky protectionism, but I think a lot of them are also kind of potentially legal under the WTO, or the assessment of the countries, of the officials and ministries are, it's going to be difficult to take these types of cases to the WTO. What that really then points to is a need for more rules, for revising the rules, for ensuring that insofar as these types of policy measures create externalities, that we actually have a system to deal with it, which does not rely on unilateral behavior and actions of the type the United States is now taking. So all that to say and to motivate that the WTO rulebook really needs to be updating. And if you ask, what has the WTO been doing to deal with these sources of trade tensions? Essentially, it's been missing in action, right? There hasn't been a whole lot done. The WTO is not completely useless in the sense that they haven't been doing anything. There has been actually quite a bit of attention being given to facilitating trade. There's an agreement on trade facilitation, which is a good thing for the world economy, but they really haven't been dealing with these policies that create spillovers. And what we argue in the report is that WTO working practices are part of the reason why we're not seeing anything particularly fast or effective being done. And there's a number of things that we identify under that heading of working practices. One is that the WTO operates by consensus. So decision making is by consensus. And that has been abused to actually block even discussion of issues that one country doesn't want to discuss. Right? So here we're not talking about negotiated agreements. We're not talking about things that might potentially have teeth and that you want to block. No, we're just using the veto rights we have to prevent deliberation, discussion of issues, which also then means there's a strong disincentive to actually bring those issues to the WTO, because if you have a problem or you perceive there to be a problem with certain types of policies, 2 or 3 countries can just say, no, we're not going to talk about this. A second working practice which is important is special and differential treatment. Right? And special and differential treatment was created in the 1950s and 1960s as a way to address development concerns. And essentially what they boil down to is that there's less than full reciprocity needs to be given by developing countries in the context of negotiations. And we can argue about whether that makes sense or not in the 1960s. I would argue that in 2018 it really doesn't make much sense at all, given that we're in a world of global value chains where you actually need to import to be competitive. But nonetheless, development is an important issue. Right? So we need to come up with a new way and a more effective way of dealing with development concerns. But currently, one of the reasons we are where we are is because the traditional form of special and differential treatment has been used by developing countries, including China, including advanced countries, to say, no, we're not going to give you full reciprocity. We want to do less than the US or the EU or Japan would do, and increasingly that's been a source of huge frustration for negotiators from OECD countries, first and foremost the United States. And then finally, and this is linked to consensus, many developing countries have been arguing we are not going to consider talking about new issues until we finish the Doha round. Right? So they say we have a mandate from our ministers, that is the Doha negotiating mandate. We need to finish that, and we don't really have a mandate for ministers to actually talk about new issues. And of course, we're not going to get a mandate for ministers to talk about new issues because they want to finish the Doha round. So this has been factors behind where we are on the WTO front, and they've been important factors in explaining the shift towards preferential trade agreements. Right now, there's lots of reasons why countries negotiate preferential trade agreements, but one of them has been that you can't really deal with new issues like the digital economy, e-commerce, trade and services, regulatory cooperation, competition, investment policies in the WTO, precisely because of these factors. So we have 3 related challenges, which we try to deal with in the report. We need to deal with these trade tensions, right? Because obviously if we don't, we can very quickly end into a situation where we end up in a global trade war, which would be hugely detrimental to global welfare. We need to address development concerns more effectively, right? So this special and differential treatment approach hasn't really worked, but nonetheless, it's really important that the WTO become more relevant to poor countries, while at the same time incentivizing the more advanced developing countries to participate more fully. And third, and this is what most of the report is about, we need to improve the organizational performance of the WTO. And this has different dimensions. It relates to implementation of existing agreements, in particular transparency provisions. It relates to having an effective dispute settlement mechanism, which is now at risk really of dying completely if we don't have enough appellate body judges to rule on appeals. It also implies a more effective venue for deliberation on new issues, and of course, the core role of the WTO, which is to be a forum for the negotiation of agreements. So let me quickly take you through the core areas in which we make recommendations in terms of where to go from here. And the first one, which I think is not going to surprise anyone in this room, and which is kind of blindingly obvious, you need to restart a process where you can actually have a policy dialogue in the WTO. Right? So right now we have a lot of bilateral discussions, we have a lot of allegations. We don't have a lot of kind of substantive, constructive discussion in the WTO on all these types of policy areas that are creating conflict in trade. So that includes the dispute settlement mechanism. So the United States is objecting to how the WTO appellate body operates. It seems kind of obvious that you need to sit down and say, okay, what concerns do you have with the appellate body? How do we collectively respond to those concerns? Is there really a need to address them? How can we address them? What can we do? Right now, again, these are discussions that happen bilaterally, informally. The US will regularly read a list of things they don't like in meetings of the dispute settlement body, but there really hasn't been that constructive engagement to say, okay, let's actually try and figure out where we agree on something that needs to be fixed and can be fixed. I think very important dimension of this is to start a process where we actually identify what are the issues that really matter from a global welfare perspective, from a systemic perspective, as opposed to issues which are attracting a lot of heat, which may be underlying some of the retaliation and unilateral use of policies we're seeing, but where essentially what we're talking about are rents that are being captured by a particular industry. Right? And these are very different things. And I think we should be focusing on what matters from a systemic global welfare point of view, as opposed to trying to make life easier for a particular industry. And here the stylized fact is there's been very little, at least in my view, kind of solid, objective, analytical work that actually focuses on what are the spillovers that are created by the policies that the EU, the US, is objecting to with respect to what is being done by other countries. Right? Whether that's China, India, Brazil, or for that matter, the US or the EU. Now, there's no magic bullets to this policy dialogue, but we argue that this is really something that should be the bread and butter of the WTO, and the objective here should be to establish a roadmap on where do we go? How do we deal with these conflicts, but also how do we deal with the legacy of the failed Doha round? How can we actually move forward to kind of deal with a lot of the issues that matter for developing countries and that have not been addressed, right? So think about really long-standing, very old issues like tariff escalation, like agricultural support policies. These are things that really matter for developing countries. They are, I think, legitimately very frustrated that no progress has been made on this, so that has to be part of that agenda. Right, but what we're really talking about here is a need to come up with a new agenda that addresses some of the new issues where we have a need for multilateral cooperation. Think about policies that affect data flows, old issues which were on the Doha round and which we haven't been able to deal with, but also these conflicts that we have today between the large players. Right, and a necessary condition for this is to actually start a process of deliberation and discussion and to leverage the existing flexibility that exists in the WTO to actually have that discussion. Where can that discussion take place? This is just a graph that shows you kind of the organogram of the WTO, and the only thing you really need to take away from this is that there are a large number of WTO bodies, committees, that actually have a mandate to talk about very specific trade policies. Right? Some of those trade policies we actually have agreements on, so the committee is responsible for tracking implementation of the agreement. Some of those bodies are essentially there to talk about potential new agreements or to talk about policy issues that are of interest to particular countries. So there's a lot you can build on. You don't need to reinvent, you don't need to reorganize the WTO to actually have these types of discussions. In addition to this policy dialogue process that we advocate in the report, we also suggest that it would be useful to actually start a process of self-reflection in the WTO at the level of these different bodies, right? And that one of the stylized facts here is that there's huge heterogeneity in terms of what different committees actually do and the extent to which they've actually been able to be innovative, right? So if we think about committees on standards, on sanitary, phytosanitary measures, or technical barriers to trade, they've actually invented approaches to actually deal with incipient disputes. They have a mechanism to actually have a discussion on the potential effect of new standards. We don't see that in other committees, right? We see much less in the way of actual engagement on substance in other committees. So I think one of the ways to maybe strengthen the regular WTO business is to start a process where you actually ask the people who are representing their governments in these committees, what are you doing? What would you like to do? You know, what do you think your mandate is? And very importantly, do you have the tools you need to actually achieve those goals, right? Now, some people might say, well, that should be kind of obvious, but I think it would actually be useful to try and illustrate a number of features of these bodies, which will also help the process of moving forward. One is it would help identify who is your constituency, right? So who are you working for? That might be a regulatory type of community, it might be business organizations, but essentially the question here is, who are they? What do you do? Do you actually deliver what these guys want? And one kind of element of that process could actually be, well, who are those people, right? And actually then you have to start talking to those people. What could we actually do, or what should we do to actually address your issues? The same thing applies to transparency. So the United States, I think very legitimately, is making a big deal out of the fact that many countries do not notify all of the policies that they should be notifying to the WTO. One approach they're suggesting is we need a much bigger legal stick to kind of beat countries over the head to actually do what they should be doing or what they committed to doing. An alternative approach is to say, building on this, you know, what's our mandate, what are we trying to do, what do we need to deliver, and what kind of information do we need to actually do our job? Right, and I think it's probably fair to say, and one of the hypotheses we have here is that the WTO reflects agreements and provisions that were negotiated in the 1960s. Right? So a lot of what is in there is rather old. So you could ask yourself, is everything that is in there that you have to formally notify, is that something that is still useful? Are there things that we don't have to notify that actually would be very useful for us to have as members of a committee to do our job? Right, so what information do we actually need? So that could be part of that process. I think a process of self-reflection at the committee level would also be useful to deal with the development agenda and the development concerns. Right, so instead of just taking as rote, we need special and differential treatment, meaning that whatever we have in a particular agreement, we only do 60% of, or we should be exempted from provision X in agreement Y, is to ask, what actually do you need to promote development? What actually do you need if you're representing a developing country to actually to do your job, right? To actually satisfy what your constituencies would like to see you do, and ask the question, what actually is good from a development perspective? So partly that implies actually identifying how do current WTO rules actually impede you, if you're representing a developing country, from actually putting in place pro-development policies or good policy practices That's one part of the question, but I think the other part of the question is, what do you actually need to do? And then you can have a discussion as to how you can actually try and achieve whatever those needs might be. But again, the point here is you do this in the context of a technical group of officials who are responsible for a particular area. So we're not talking here about 30,000 feet, what does it mean for development strategies. We're talking very concrete nuts and bolts, right? We're talking about rules of origin, we're talking about customs valuation, we're talking about licensing, and so forth. So, final thing that we argue could be done, again at the level of these committees, is to give them a mandate to actually look at what is happening in preferential trade agreements. Right, so preferential trade agreements address pretty much everything that is being addressed by the WTO, plus often new things. But at least on the issues where there's overlap, there's a lot of innovation that has been happening in trade agreements, right? Whether that's the agreement between Australia and New Zealand and what they've been doing, whether it's in the context of ASEAN, whether it's in the context of what's been negotiated in the CPTPP, elements of that could potentially be multilateralized and brought into what is actually covered by these committees. So again, starting a bottoms-up process where we say, okay, let's have that discussion at the committee level, where again, we're talking technical stuff. How do we do this in the CPTPP? How has the EU actually done this in the context of the European neighborhood policies? Right, so there's been a lot of action on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis that has actually kind of complemented what the WTO is trying to do, but there's no mechanism to actually feed that back into these committees in the WTO. Right, there's a committee on regional trade agreements. What that committee does is essentially look at new agreements. They write down what the legal provisions are. There is, as far as I can tell, never any discussion of what's our experience in actually implementing Agreement X. What have we learned, what we tried to do? What has been a total disaster, right? So please, let's not do that. And what has been very successful, right? So there's a lot to be learned from that. But again, the main point here is we do this at the technical level. An element of this, and again, I won't belabor this in the interest of time, but it's to really connect back to the constituencies that have an interest in whatever topic a relevant WTO body is actually dealing with. Right? So I think it's very important to have people involved in this process who have a stake or an interest in the subjects that are being addressed, and that extends beyond trade officials. Right? So one of the challenges, how do you connect to those constituencies that actually have an interest in what you do? And then we have kind of a more technical suggestion to make in terms of how the committees actually operate. So currently in the WTO, committees are chaired by an ambassador from a particular country who has a one-year appointment, and then a new chairman takes over. So there's a lot of turnover. And what we suggest is there might be something here to be learned from the OECD, where you actually establish kind of steering groups or a bureau where you actually have a small group of representatives from countries who are all responsible for helping to manage the work of a committee. So then we'd have a lot more chairs could rotate in and out of that, but there would be more continuity. And one positive dimension of this potentially would be if you have more people involved in the management of what a group does, you might also have less vetoes by countries who say, no, we don't think it's a good idea to actually talk about issue X here. Third recommendation deals with the consensus working practice and essentially advocates much more use of open plurilateral approaches under the umbrella of the WTO. Right? And here with open, we mean they're open to any country that would like to join in a particular new agreement, but they're also open in the sense that they're applied on a non-discriminatory basis. Right? So here we're not talking about agreements like the government procurement agreement, where essentially a group comes together and says, we'll open access to our procurement market, but only to signatories of the agreement. Here we're talking about agreements where a group of countries comes together and says, we think it really makes sense to do the following in issue X, and we're just going to do that, right? And we're going to apply it in general on a non-discriminatory basis. So in practice, what that means in terms of coverage is that these are likely to be issues that deal with regulatory types of questions, right? Where essentially a government has to decide, how do we want to regulate a particular area? once it decides how it wants to do that, it's going to apply that to domestic goods, to foreign goods, domestic providers, foreign providers equally. Right? So this is really more an agenda that revolves around what actually is good regulatory practice, what makes sense to do. You could also put that in a development context and say what actually makes sense to do to promote development. Once you've identified that, you just go off and do it, and you apply it to everyone. That is a partial solution to the problem, right? Partial because it's not going to work if we're talking about policies that actually generate large negative spillovers, right? So mostly these are going to be potentially available for issues that, if you think about it in economic terms, are likely to be resulting in reducing trade costs or helping to deal with a particular market failure if we're talking about regulation. Right? They're not going to be very feasible to actually try and induce country X to stop subsidizing its industry. If country X does not join the agreement, country X will continue to do whatever they're doing. But what we argue in the report is there's actually much more scope for these plurilateral types of arrangements than one might think, precisely because a lot of the agenda is shifting into a more regulatory set of issues. Right? One kind of positive dimension of more plurilateral agreements, open plurilateral agreements in the WTO, is it's a way of shifting some of the PTA-based energy into the WTO context, right? So again, some of the things I was talking about earlier with what can we learn from PTAs, one implication of that is you could actually do specific elements of PTAs that don't require discrimination. You could actually adopt that into some kind of a plurilateral agreement in the WTO. Okay, so again, I won't belabor the point here, but I think the point here really is it's critical mass-based type of cooperation, non-discriminatory, and open processes are going to be critical on this. Because if openness, part of the openness is that anybody can join later down the road as well, so this needs to be transparent. And I think one of the big advantages of the WTO in terms of doing plurilateral agreements in the WTO compared to preferential trade agreements is that by definition they're going to be much more transparent. They're going to be scrutinized. You're going to have to report to the General Counsel, and you're going to have the WTO Secretariat involved in knowing what is going on, right? So the Secretariat can then be a focal point and a contact for countries that are potentially interested in joining or for countries who are simply interested in knowing what is going on. Fourth recommendation is to strengthen the Secretariat, or to strengthen the ability of the Secretariat to actually play a constructive role. Right? So the WTO is famous for being member-driven. Right? A member-driven means the WTO Secretariat has nothing to say. Right? I used to work for the World Bank, and there the Secretariat, i.e. the staff of the World Bank, really didn't worry very much about what was going on in the board. They didn't worry too much about what governments actually thought. They were more focused on the substance of issues. The WTO Secretariat lives in a very different world, right? So they are really not allowed to do a whole lot or to say what they think. They're also really not allowed to, on a unilateral basis, actually put forward proposals to committees or to inform committees as to what might be going on in a different arena. So empowering the Secretariat to actually undertake more initiative to support WTO bodies and activities could actually help this whole process that I've been talking about so far along, including giving them a much greater mandate to connect to other specialized agencies, to regional entities. And of course, that happens to some extent already on an ad hoc basis, but I think it would be much better to actually kind of strengthen that link and make that a formal mandate that they have to do. And that includes kind of giving them a bit more in the way of resources to actually be useful to the membership. Right, so currently the WTO spends a lot of money on technical assistance. If you look at what is that technical assistance, and actually I'm speaking in the ADBI, so I don't need to tell you about this, but a lot of it is seminars, right? It's not a lot of actual sitting down with counterparts in ministries to help them actually deal with a particular problem they have. Right now, a bit more of that could actually help connect the WTO to constituencies in capitals that actually matter for the sustained health of the WTO, right? So that's one of the reasons we're suggesting that this is something to consider. Of course, you need to worry about mission creep. You need to worry about duplication, that other organizations who might be better placed to do something actually do that. But there again, I think linking to those other organizations is a necessary condition for meeting that condition. Fifth recommendation revolves around actually assessing the performance of the WTO. Right now, for many people, it comes as a big surprise to hear that there's no evaluation process in the WTO. Right, so if you think about the IMF, if you think about the World Bank, even the OECD, they all have some kind of mechanism in place, especially the development banks and the IMF. They have independent external offices that actually evaluate what these organizations are doing, whether they've achieved their mandate, whether there are things to be learned from experience, and so forth. We don't have that in the WTO. So what we have in the WTO is monitoring of trade policy by WTO members, not necessarily a lot of learning from that monitoring, but there's no process that actually asks, okay, so how has the dispute settlement body actually worked over the last 5 years, and are there things we should learn from what has been happening in dispute settlement that might inform how we might revise the terms of reference for, let's say, the appellate body, right, that we could agree on. So that's missing. So what we suggest, and we had a big discussion on this in the group, some people arguing we really need to have something like the IMF has, an independent external organization for evaluation. Others saying, well, that sounds a bridge too far to us, not just politically, but also in terms of actually having people who understand how this place actually works. So what was agreed is that what, at the very least, to start with, emulating something the OECD does, right, which is an internal process, which is driven by members, which is driven by representatives of governments, where they actually themselves, with the help of some secretariat staff, look at what was the mandate that was given to a particular committee, what was done in this committee, what did we do with the resources we had, how effectively were those used, and what can we learn from other committees that have operated in different areas, but where they might be doing something innovative that we can learn from. Right, now that's a process where, again, if you talk to people who have worked at the OECD, including ambassadors who have represented countries at the OECD, there are different perceptions about how effective this process is, but most of the people I've talked to said this helps, right? And it also helps because it's a mechanism to actually raise issues to the General Council, right? So you can kind of feed things up the chain. Ministers can actually take decisions based on information that otherwise they wouldn't even confront in terms of actually having a discussion about. So we suggest something along the same lines could help for the WTO, both as a mechanism to learn, but also as a mechanism to improve accountability to the outside world in terms of what are we actually doing, what is the effect of what we're doing, and it could help identify potential silo problems, right? And again, this is trade facilitation for me is the perfect example, right? So we have a trade facilitation agreement, great, but a lot of trade facilitation revolves around logistics and services, not part of the trade facilitation agreement. It also involves customs valuation, not part of the trade facilitation agreement. So there are a lot of these issues that really need to come together in a package to deal with, to actually help realize the objectives that the trade facilitation agreement has. So that's, this process could actually help resolve some of those silo problems. Finally, this is the last recommendation in the report, is to rethink kind of outreach and communication strategies. Right, so I'm an economist. I've worked in the GATT. I know the people who have been working in the WTO on this. And for those of you who are economists in the room and who have done this type, who have been working in these types of environments, you know that the way things are sold is to say the boss comes into your office and says, I need a big number. Right, so this will increase trade by 500 billion, or we're going to create 200 million jobs, whatever. that is simply not a credible approach, because quite frequently what has been negotiated is not going to generate these types of numbers. But I think more importantly, it's misleading, because what this is mostly about, it's not about kind of increasing trade, it's certainly not about creating jobs, because we know that trade doesn't create jobs, it just reallocates them. What it's really about is creating certainty, reducing uncertainty for firms, putting in place rules of the game, putting in place a system where we can actually govern how governments deal with trade policy, right? That's what the system is actually generating for you. And I think there's much too little kind of a focus on trying to explain what the real deliverables, what the real value added of the system is. I think the focus on model-based kind of numbers and saying this is what, this is how we defend what is being done has really backfired. It results in a big reduction in credibility, because you can always find a crazy economist who will write down a crazy model and show my model is much better, your model is bad, and we just end up in a fight about models and talking about elasticities and parameters. And you've lost my mother 10 minutes ago, right? So that really doesn't resonate. It's not that we shouldn't be doing this. I think it's very important, certainly to inform negotiations, but it's not a good way to sell what we're doing. So it's really about rules, it's about governance, and it's about helping governments to use welfare-enhancing policies which will promote development. Okay, part of that issue here is to connect more to business, right? Because the business community is, of course, best placed to actually explain why these things matter. And there again, what we argue in the report is that business really has not been doing a particularly good job, right? So individual businesses are very good at lobbying individual governments for things they want fixed or to happen, but it's very infrequent to see a CEO of a company actually talk to his staff, to the workforce, and actually explain why this thing actually matters to us. And why, when you go into a voting booth, you really need to think a little bit about, what matters to you, what is in your self-interest as an employee who is tied into global value chains that is very dependent on other countries actually following the rules of the game, and therefore we also doing that. So I think there's a lot to be done there. We had a parliamentarian as a member of this particular committee, and one of the points she brought out very strongly was to say she frequently feels abandoned by the business community every time she goes into a town to speak about trade. It's very hard to get people from the business community, she said, with her to actually explain why this matters to them, right? So I think this is one dimension where more regular engagement with the WTO could actually help kind of move the needle. Okay, final point is, great. Is this going to do anything? And who's going to do it? Right? So we need leadership. And who's going to be doing the leading on this? Right? Because so far, one of the reasons, of course, we're in the hole we're in is because everybody has been largely hiding. Right? So a lot of countries have been hiding behind special and differential treatment, and we must finish the Doha round. So how are we going to change that dynamic? Right? And I think the other big part of this equation is we have the system we have today because of the United States and the United Kingdom, who basically wrote down the provisions of the GATT in the 1940s. And the US has been providing leadership pretty much ever since. Right? Now, that leadership, at least temporarily, is gone. Right? And I'm not sure how temporary it actually is, because for all of Mr. Trump's very many faults, a lot of the kind of criticism and a lot of the unhappiness with the WTO was very much present under the Obama administration as well. Right? So we're talking here about something that I think is much more structural than tied to a particular individual. But I think nonetheless, the positive side of this story is that even though it might look like things are pretty crazy, the United States is very actively engaged. Right? And if you read Ambassador Lighthizer speech that he gave in Buenos Aires, and if you look at what's been happening since then, there are very specific, concrete things that are basically written down and saying, these are things we need to fix. These are real problems. Right? So I think from that point of view, it's quite positive and constructive, and there has been a reaction, right? So we have now the EU is engaged in thinking through what kind of WTO reforms actually would make sense, not just for us as the European Union, but more generally. And of course, we have a lot of countries that have been involved in deep integration agreements. Right? And I think first and foremost here, we can think about the countries that have signed the CPTPP. Right? And these are, of course, countries that have committed to obligations which go quite significantly beyond what we have in the WTO. So between the EU, the CPTPP members, and a large number of small countries that are kind of collected in a group called the Friends of the Multilateral System, we have a critical mass of countries that really has already signaled we are committed to actually making binding and committing to binding disciplines in trade agreements, and we are committed to helping to keep the show on the road. But ultimately, it really boils down to how much do countries value the system, and is there a willingness on the part of the countries that do value the system to essentially tell the countries that don't want to play the game, goodbye. Right? And I think that might be a rather crude way of putting what is on the table now in terms of what the US is telling countries, but I think that's where we are. So insofar as we end up in a situation where enough countries say no, I think we are going to be talking about Plan B. We can talk in the discussion, what does Plan B look like? But I would argue two things in closing. One is the WTO matters much more for emerging economies than it does for industrialized economies. And this is from a survey that was done this year, where around 1,000 people in large countries were asked, is the WTO an important institution? And the one thing to take away from this graph is that if you look at the countries, the blue bar essentially says, yes, WTO is really important for us as a country. We have China, Mexico, Turkey, Indonesia, India, Russia, all part of the set that says this really matters to us, right? So that's one kind of sign of hope that these countries will actually do more than they have been doing to date to actually defend the system. And then finally, just in terms of the large countries, if you take the US out of the equation and you say, okay, EU, Japan, and China collectively account for over a third of world trade, those countries obviously have a great stake also in keeping this show on the road. But as I emphasized, even though the US, you might say, well, is not being particularly constructive at the moment, again, I would argue that they're certainly part of the discussion, and there are ongoing efforts to actually try and bring these three together to actually try and make some of the changes we've been talking about in this presentation. So I'm a perennial optimist, so I am of the view that the shaking of the cage that we read about in the paper every day might actually get us to a better place, and that's certainly something that I hope will actually materialize. Thanks.